Hello and welcome to Inside the Lab, a program bringing you news and information about autism spectrum disorders. My name is Dr. Christelle Hudry and I'm a lecturer and a member of the Olga Tennyson Autism Research Centre. Today is our fourth episode of Inside the Lab and we're going to be talking about the topic of intervention for autism spectrum disorders. I have two guests with me on the program. In the studio we have Dr. Giacomo Vivanti, who I'll introduce in a moment, and coming via virtually to us from California, we have John McCacken, who I'll also introduce in a moment. So perhaps I'll start in the studio with you, Giacomo. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Would you like to tell us a little bit about your work in early intervention for autism?
Yes, we're doing research on how do children with autism learn. We're trying to understand in general how children with autism learn and why some children learn more rapidly than others. And we're also investigating how to teach children with autism so that they learn. We're focusing on the Early Start Denver model, which is a play-based approach developed by Sally Rogers in California. I used to work with her there before coming here. What we're doing here, we're trying to translate the principles of this model into sustainable community practice here in Australia.
Great, thank you. So we'll talk more about different elements of that. And so now turning to you, John. So welcome and thanks for joining us via the internet from California, from your office there. Would you like to tell us a bit about your early intervention work, just to start off with, to give us a bit of background to yourself?
We have a clinic here near Los Angeles, and we serve approximately 40 children. And the model that we use is intensive behavioral intervention. It's a model that was pioneered and we were trained under Dr. Ivar Lovaas back in the 1970s at UCLA. And it's a work that we've continued to refine and develop and look for ways to be able to implement it on a wider spread basis in a community-based clinic.
Great, thank you. And my own research in early intervention has traditionally been in the parent-mediated interventions, so interventions where we work with parents to help them to learn skills which they then deliver an intervention to their children in everyday home-based settings. And I worked particularly with the Preschool Autism Communication Trial Consortium led by Dr. Jonathan Green in the UK. So I think it's really nice to have the three of us come together to talk about early intervention because we all come at it from slightly different perspectives and theoretical models. And so what I think we would like to talk about today are aspects to do with research on early intervention. So what we know about early intervention from research, what some of the barriers are, what the future research needs to be, and then also talking more about translation from research into practice, so what some of the challenges and barriers are there. But before we get onto that, I just thought we'd start really quickly talking a little bit about why we do early intervention, or why we do any intervention for people with autism spectrum disorders, because that's a contentious topic in itself. So what do you think, why is intervention important? So Giacomo, perhaps start with you. Why do we do intervention for people, children, adults with autism?
Well, I think it's very important when we have a research question, for example, when we're investigating whether a specific treatment works, we need to ask ourselves why, what is the aim of this treatment? What are we trying to do here? And it's important to acknowledge that there are different philosophies. Some of our colleagues in early intervention, for example, are interested in changing the environment to create a more autism-friendly environment so that children with autism, with their characteristics, they can function better in the environment. While other programs, including our programs, are more about changing the behavior, changing the way the child is functioning in the environment. I think that both positions are legitimate, but it's important to have a specific theoretical framework, knowing exactly what you're aiming at. And once you have that, it's important that people with different positions learn from different perspectives.
There's been some recent high-profile individuals who talk about early intervention or talk about any intervention and really feel strongly against this position. John, what would you say about your view on why early intervention is important?
I understand the sentiment that people are voicing, the concern that we're somehow altering an individual's fundamental personality, changing the essence of who they are. But I don't actually see it that way, particularly when it comes to young children. What we see for children with autism is that the natural environment does not enable them to learn in the way that typically developing children are learning. So they end up very much behind developmentally in terms of their ability to engage in the activities of daily life, to be able to communicate effectively. And particularly a hallmark with autism is not be able to navigate the social world. And I think philosophically, as teachers and as parents, we recognize that with young children, we have a responsibility to help them make decisions that they're not able, healthy decisions that they would not be able to make for themselves. Whether it's you can't eat the whole bag of cookies, to you need to brush your teeth before you go to bed. I think we recognize that it is the right thing for us to do as parents and teachers to guide children and to put limits on choices that they might prefer to make. And I do think it's important for someone who's doing this kind of intervention to think that through and make sure that it does, that philosophically and morally, it does in fact make sense. But what we're aiming to do in the behavioral model is to provide a feedback loop that actually enables them to learn. And we know that it needs to be a specialized approach to teaching and providing feedback that's clear and also motivating in order for them to learn. They're capable of learning, but just not in the same way.
I guess it comes to the difficulty that autism spectrum disorders are so heterogeneous. There's sort of real variety in the severity of the symptoms or the adaptive behaviour, the clinical functioning that different individuals have. And I guess the conflict comes about when we have very high functioning, very able individuals who really have strongly, passionately feel that that their way of life or their position in life, that they have something really important to bring to society, and that any sense of tempering that or tampering with that is detrimental. But then, like you say, John, on the other hand, there are children, and even typically developing children. As parents, we wouldn't just let our typical kids do whatever they want, whenever they want. We would impose boundaries and rules for teaching and learning purposes. So there are children with autism who require that as well. Yeah.
Well, I think that the main point is that it's not that education or early intervention in general is necessarily something different. It's necessarily incompatible with the appreciation of diversity or neurodiversity. Definitely, there is a shift in the field from a medical model, which is about curing deviations from normality, to a social model, which is about increasing opportunities for self-determination in people with disabilities and people with autism. We definitely prefer the social model. We want to increase opportunities for self-determination. But how do you do that? You do that with teaching and with intensive teaching, because this is something that helps children with autism learning. And once a child learns how to communicate, they'll be able to express their beautiful, idiosyncratic diversity. They will be able to enjoy the same human rights that other people enjoy, voting, for example. Making decisions about expressing themselves. But if you don't teach communication first, their ability to advocate for their rights and for their diversity will be pretty limited.
Sure. So I don't want to spend too long on this particular topic, because I think we could talk about this for the whole session. And indeed, we're planning to have another panel discussion later in 2014 about this issue of neurodiversity versus sort of intervention normalisation. So let's come to particularly talk about research around early intervention. So we've all worked sort of clinically and or doing research on different types of early intervention. And, you know, 40 years down the track since early intervention in autism research started, I feel like there's still very little consensus in the field as to what exactly we're doing, perhaps why we're doing it, who we're doing it for, etc. John, perhaps we'll start with you because you're working with the early intensive behavioural intervention, sort of ABA, applied behaviour analysis models, which are perhaps the first early interventions that were really charted and demonstrated for kids with autism. Tell us what your experiences and thoughts are on where we've come in the time since that research began.
There certainly has been much greater acceptance of a model of intervention that is intensive and greater appreciation of the capability that children, even severely impaired children with autism, are able to achieve impressive levels of functioning in later childhood and even into adulthood, most importantly. And we recognize that unlike in the earliest days, the 1950s, for example, in not that long after autism was first identified as a distinct syndrome, the belief at that time was that individuals with autism were not educable, and therefore no effort was made to actually teach them. And it turned out to be, unfortunately, a self-fulfilling prophecy, that if you don't teach them, in fact, they do end up educationally very disadvantaged.
Yeah.
And as it was demonstrated that the behavior which seems puzzling to us on the surface, actually, it is rational and functional. And we just need to understand what are the behavioral principles that the individual is responding to and learn how to alter the environment in such a way as to help them learn and motivate them to do the things that are going to be to their greater benefit.
Okay. And Giacomo, you come from a different model of intervention and perhaps a different way of thinking about intervention as well. How do you sort of see the history of early intervention research and what's changed, where we've started and where we've come to at this stage?
Well, there is a positive trend of integrating research on development now into clinical practice, into intervention. So the Early Start Denver model is a good example of integration of principles and notions that came from research on how typically developing children learn, and uses this developmental theory as a framework to inform educational strategies. So this is definitely good. The issues around having a common perspective on what is it that we need to do with children with autism comes from the fact that I think first there are different people who will support different approaches or different ideas about interventions that are not necessarily based on evidence. So one can be supportive of a particular treatment because it's particularly consistent with an idea about autism, which is more appealing to some people or to others. And sometimes you can have lobbies, like in my country, in Italy, there is definitely a psychoanalytical lobby. And their idea of treatment is consistent with the idea of autism and the idea of development that come from that framework. And they're politically powerful. And this is how it works. So it has nothing to do with evidence. It's a completely different thing. And I know it's the same in different countries.
Yeah. So clearly, in order to get to the point where we have a good understanding of what the best treatment is, we've got to overcome some different barriers. So it sounds like you're saying that one of those is an ideological or that sort of barrier of stepping away from just what we think must be right to actually looking at what the evidence tells us is working and then applying that. What are some of the other barriers that you see to moving early intervention research forward so that we can come to an understanding?
Look, one particular barrier, I think, is the research on how children with autism learn is quite limited. In terms of research on how the brain responds to learning opportunities, how the cognitive organization of children with autism enable them to learn from the environment. Unfortunately, most of that research is done on high-functioning children with autism, especially neuroimaging research on how the brain responds to learning opportunities. It's almost entirely done on children with higher functioning autism. So the children that we see in our centers they're different from the children who participate in those research. They have different educational needs. So if we keep excluding children with lower functioning autism, we won't be able to understand how to teach them so that they learn. Because if we don't know how they learn, because we don't do research on them, then we won't be able to teach them. And often, unfortunately, when we see that these children don't learn, clinicians tend to say, well, it's because this child has mental retardation and this is why it's not learning. It's not the child's fault if the child is not learning. It's because we're not aware, we don't know how to teach them so that they learn. Yeah. So research needs to address the needs of all children with autism.
Why do you think those children have been left out of research traditionally? Is it just convenient? They don't sit still very well? It's hard to get them into a scanner or whatever it is to get them to do tasks? What's the reason for that?
Well, there is that for sure. It's easier to run a project that involves participants who are very compliant. There's also an assumption that in my knowledge, was never supported by any evidence, which is that everything that we learn about high-functioning children with autism is going to be relevant for lower-functioning children with autism. I think that this particular assumption doesn't have particular evidence behind. And there is also the notion that intellectual disability or mental retardation is something different from autism that happens to be there. But as John was saying before, well, these children are behind because they're behind developmentally because they're missing learning opportunities. They're not learning from the environment unless we teach them so that they learn. So those children who are particularly severely affected, they're going to miss a lot of learning opportunities. They're going to be behind developmentally. And we don't know how to help them if we don't do research on them. Yeah.
So just to sort of summarize then what you're saying, some of the barriers to understanding early intervention are that we don't really understand how these kids learn, how their brains process the world, and then how to teach them in effective ways, and particularly then for that lower functioning group perhaps, who are less convenient to us for our studies or more difficult to intervene with, so it's easier to focus our attentions perhaps on the kids who are going to make progress, help them make progress, and these other kids get left behind. How about you, John? What do you think are the barriers to, or some of the barriers to good early intervention research?
Well, it's not just the lack of research, but the lack of acceptance of the findings of the research, is that people don't always make decisions and choices that are guided by looking at evidence. And I think evidence-based is a term that's becoming pretty often used in everyday language without really understanding what the quality of evidence is. Well, I think part of the difficulty is that we live in a culture that's not very scientifically minded, that doesn't necessarily make evaluations of information in a critical kind of way. And I think what research allows us to do is it allows us to rule out alternative hypotheses. And too often people look at a hypothesis that is appealing and perhaps intuitive, but without actually investigating it and testing it against alternative explanations, you could miss some important information. Yep. A great example of this was in the earliest days, and Giacomo alluded to, like in some countries in Europe, particularly psychoanalytic theory still is very influential in trying to promote understanding of what autism is. But in the earliest days, people thought that autism was an emotional disorder and that it was a result of a failure in the bonding between the mother and the child. And that was partly based on an observation about mental health adjustment difficulties that they observed in the parents of children with autism. And presuming that that was the cause of the autism disturbance and not considering the alternative hypothesis is that living with a child who's severely disabled is very stressful.
Yeah.
And we see higher rates of depression and many other kinds of difficulties. And so when people considered the alternative hypothesis and investigated more carefully, they came to see that that in fact that's not what is the cause of autism, that autism is a neurologically based, developmentally based problem. It has nothing to do with how the child has been treated.
I want to come back to the point that you made a little bit before that, which was about the methodology. And I think you're right that there is a lack of sort of public awareness of science and the role that science has to play in really testing out alternative hypotheses and so on. I think it's quite exciting that in the last 3 or 4 years, actually, we have seen probably the first couple of really rigorous studies in the autism field, sort of taking the methodology that comes from pharmaceutical trials, from the drug trials, where there's the randomized, controlled, blinded way of evaluating whether something does work, and trying to take that methodological rigor, which is really essential in pharmaceutical trials, where we know that there's not only the potential for a drug to benefit someone, but also to really cause harm. So we want to really be convinced that that drug is effective before we do roll that out. So trying to take the methodology that's come out of that discipline and put it into early intervention for psychosocial early intervention for kids with autism. So the PACT trial that I was involved in was one of those that came out in 2010. There's also been some randomized controlled studies of the Early Start Denver model come out at about the same time. So I think we're kind of at an exciting time now for early intervention research, where we can start to set a pretty high bar for other early intervention studies that are going to happen, to say it is possible to do this in a really rigorous way, where as researchers, so for the PACT study, as researchers, we really separated the clinical arm, the people who are delivering the intervention, from the research arm, those of us who are going to evaluate whether it worked or not. And those were completely separate things. So we would meet from time to time just to touch base and make sure we were all on the same page, but otherwise maintaining real separation there, so that there was no subjective kind of desire from the intervention team to see something that was working when perhaps it really wasn't. And so I feel that that and the randomized controlled trial that came out the same year for Early Start Denver model have started to move things in the right direction, so that we are going to really test things rigorously before we accept to say this is good, this isn't good, this works, this doesn't work. Another thought, though, sticking with kind of the barriers then for me, is that we seem to want a bit of a one-size-fits-all solution, I think, or not we, the three of us, but we in the field, or parents, families, clinicians. We want sort of a model that we can then say, this child has autism, this is the therapy we do with them, or this child has autism, they need this for this many hours, and so on. And I think that might be another area of real misunderstanding, or something we need to think about more. So what do you think, Giacomo? One size fits all?
No, definitely this is not what we're seeing in our particular program. Mm-hmm. We're seeing children doing very, very well. We're seeing children doing well, and we see a few children who should do better in terms of what our expectations were. This is not surprising to me. Autism is heterogeneous from a genetic point of view, from a biological point of view, from a behavioral point of view. So if there is variability in the biology, in the behavior of children with autism, there will be variability also in response to treatment. And this is the next, this is an important challenge for treatment research, is understanding not only what works, but what works for whom and why. Ultimately, our role as researchers is really to understand whether what we're doing can help children with autism, or can help some children with autism who have particular characteristics that make them particularly able to respond to particular educational strategies.
How about you, John? With your practice and the kids you see, what are your feelings on a one-size-fits-all model for early intensive behavioural interventions?
The intervention most definitely needs to be tailored to the learning style of the student and other individual characteristics. We see big differences in response to intervention across children. So you can't make any kind of a priori expectation about what a given child should be able to achieve. And in the behavioral model, the analysis part of the ABA is always about trying to understand if a child is not progressing, what do we need to change to find a better way, break the skill down into simpler steps, for example. And that will allow more children to make better progress. But I think the other thing that's worth saying here is that in the field of behavioral intervention, there's been a considerable evolution from 30 years ago. And in the sense that much more emphasis on positive means of motivating children, big emphasis on social development, which perhaps wasn't in the earliest days one of the biggest areas of emphasis. So I think those kinds of developments are going to enable more children to make better progress.
Is it a goal for you and for your intervention that you would be able to identify kids early on somehow and think, right, this child is right for ABA, and for this child, or maybe another alternative treatment would be better? Or are you proposing that actually ABA should be acceptable for all children and it's just modifying the goals or the strategies to make it work for every child? What's your feeling on that?
Well, you're talking to a behavioral practitioner, so take that into account here. But I also think the evidence, there's a pretty large body of evidence supporting a behavior analytic approach. And it's a much more established body of evidence than really for any other model. There's different dialects, if you want, of behavioral intervention. No two clinics are going to do things exactly the same way. So it is kind of difficult to talk about ABA as if it was a single, well-defined model. And because of the fact of an analytic and day-by-day and child-by-child framework, it does make it difficult to define it in a sort of cookbook sort of way. And in fact, we find that trying to do it in a cookbook manner is much less likely to help the greatest number of kids make the greatest amount of progress because of that individualization that's needed.
I want to come back a little bit later to more of that translation of research into practice, but if we stick with research for the time being, I guess one of the difficulties really with getting the evidence base we need and the proper evidence base for early intervention is to do with funding, I think. I think it's fair to put that out there and say that. What are your thoughts on funding for early intervention, Giacomo?
Well, the decisions of funding bodies heavily influence our knowledge. To give you an example, there's virtually no research or no solid research on how to help adults with lower functioning autism. I'm not aware, if there is, it's 0.001% of the research that exists. To me, that would be the main target of research, because obviously most people with autism are adults, and the majority of them are not high functioning, and we need to know how to help them. And however, this is not, for example, a priority of the funding bodies that I'm aware of, or not all of them. Definitely, it wasn't for many decades. Maybe things are changing now. There are logistical barriers. Some funding agencies will not fund research on intervention because they don't think it's feasible, because it's logistically very complex. And I'm working on a effectiveness study, which is different from efficacy, because we're looking at whether the same results that were documented in an ideal implementation of a program works once you translate those principles in the community. That's logistically very challenging. And it's difficult to publish as well, because you cannot randomize children. So there are a number of barriers that come not from the lack of people understanding that this is important, but it's about the priorities of those who fund research and also the logistical challenges involved in the feasibility of this research.
Yeah. So to really evaluate a particular intervention well, I guess there's a couple of stages you need to go through, and you've just alluded to these, so maybe I'll touch on them a bit more detail. So there's, you know, a new intervention might have a pilot study, so that's the first proof of concept or trial run to see whether that particular intervention has any hope of being useful to anybody. And then if there's a positive result, then what we would hopefully do next is a large efficacy study. So hopefully in a really controlled setting with a large number of participants, and this is what the PACT study was, Green et al. 2010, and the Early Start Denver model study also in 2010, was taking sort of an idea that has some value, has some worth to it, and then really trialling that very rigorously with the best possible candidate children, the best possible candidate therapists, the best possible rigor in terms of evaluating that and seeing, when put to that test of that randomized controlled trial, does it stand up? And then the next step, you know, each step gets harder. The next step is then saying, well, if we've got this great intervention that seems to work really well when all things are ideal, when all the planets align, if you like, what happens if we put that out into the community? And that's the effectiveness study that you're referring to. So what happens when we do that same intervention with every child with autism, not just the hand-picked best ones, with your average clinician or educator or childcare worker, with you know, relatively few funds to support the evaluation of how that goes. And so it's really important, we think, to go through each of those steps, because if the intervention fails at any point, well, what's the point of taking it to the next step? Yeah. But also as we go down that line, actually it gets more and more difficult to do it properly, it gets more and more difficult to publish it, because we have to convince reviewers, readers that we have done it properly. Yeah, really difficult to do that. John, I wanted to ask you, you're in a different country to us, so there are different sort of political systems, different funding schemes and so on. How do you feel that funding, from a funding point of view, that autism early intervention is perceived over there?
Well, let me first talk about it in reference to research and then talk about it in clinical practice.
Great.
It's kind of a catch-22 as far as the research goes, because although the experiments, the research studies that have been published have tended to rely more on quasi-experimental designs and not included that random assignment piece that you talked about, there's an important practical reason for that. And if you think about a drug study by comparison to what we're doing here, random assignment is very feasible over an investigation that's going to take maybe 10 weeks, a few months to be able to obtain the results. Obviously, you need longer-term follow-up in terms of safety, but when it comes to effectiveness, our expectation is that we would only consider using a drug if there's impressive results that can be obtained in a reasonably short period of time. Mm-hmm. And the nature of the intensive early intervention for children with autism is enormously expensive and takes a long time. You're looking at a study that would take 5 to 10 years to implement, and millions of dollars. Mm-hmm. Many journal editors, at least in the United States, are of a mind that they're satisfied that behavioral approaches are effective. We don't need any more studies demonstrating that it's effective. Mm-hmm. Let's go on and look at some of the component analysis type studies. Let's look at something like parent training. Mm-hmm. Let's look at staff training variables, and get into the nitty-gritty of the intervention. And we don't need more studies that show that we should be doing early intervention and that they need to be behavioral. Mm-hmm. We, also for ourselves as a clinical service agency, we can do a limited amount of research, but we're not connected to a university, so we don't have access to big government grants to do some of the kind of research that you're talking about. We can do smaller scale studies looking at effective ways of teaching skills to children, what kinds of prompting strategies are more effective, error correction strategies, and things like that.
Okay.
As far as funding goes, it's getting better in the United States, and I think I know that we're definitely ahead of where it is in Australia. It still remains an enormous challenge, but more and more states in the U.S. have now mandated coverage for behavioral intervention, whereas before insurance companies were able to get off the hook claiming that it was experimental, that it's not medically necessary, or trying to argue that autism is not a treatable condition.
Right.
And so it has taken changes in the law to force the insurance companies now to provide that intervention. And it's now becoming, because of that, more widely available.
That's really interesting. What sort of time frame have you seen that change in, with insurance companies starting
It started maybe about 5 years ago with a handful of states. And I think now it's around 30 of the 50 states have some kind of coverage. In several states, there's a cap, an annual dollar cap, that translates into a maximum of about 15 hours per week for children. And we know that many children need more than 15 hours a week of intervention. If you're aiming to do a really intensive kind of intervention and make significant impact on a broad area of functioning areas. But California, for example, has no cap. So it potentially kids are going to be able to get what they actually need.
Yeah. One of the things, a point you mentioned before, one of the things that does worry me a little bit about funding and research being sort of so tightly packaged is that I worry we could get into a bit of a self-fulfilling, or a bit of a vicious cycle where it's hard to get out of things. So you've mentioned that behavioural interventions have a reputation for being very well established now, so there isn't the need anymore to fund ongoing trials of does it work or doesn't it work, and we can now start to focus more on the finer details, which is fantastic. But I do worry with something like that might prevent other models of intervention, like a developmental based approach, like a parent mediated approach, of getting funding to trial that out, because presumably we're not saying only behavioural interventions work and others don't, but probably different models have different things to offer. So I worry that in a system where funding is now capped because or stopped because it says, well, we know the answer, let's stop testing other things, that it might be inhibiting other different types of interventions from getting studied. Any thoughts on that, John?
Well, I think we're at the stage now where we need to do head-to-head comparisons, and that potentially allows for looking at individual child variables, as Giacomo referred to earlier. And I see, for example, the developmental approach and the behavioral approach as being on a continuum and at slightly different points on a continuum. But I think the overlap in what the two models would aim to do is considerable. And it's more perhaps a degree of emphasis. And also, I think within both models, you see a movement toward less structure for children who don't need a highly structured approach, and more structure for children who aren't faring well in a less structured, more naturalistic approach. I think the main difference is probably the entry point, in that in the behavioral model, we probably tend to start more structured and progress to less structured. And I think in the developmental model, as I understand it, it would be more likely to start a little less structured than where we would start, but certainly prepared to become more structured for those kids who need it.
I think you make the really great point there that the research now needs to move away from just does a therapy work, which we know the answer for that for a lot of different interventions, to actually testing models against one another, not because we're trying to say we think this one's better than that one, but actually by having direct comparison, we'll be able to start understanding what exactly about the two is different and what is actually quite similar, just in looking at it in slightly different ways. And for which kids is one approach slightly more beneficial than the other, and so on. So I think that's a really great point. Giacomo, what do you think about that state of sort of funding research and how we need to move forward?
I perfectly agree with John. I mean, the point is having some evidence behind any notion around one therapy working better for some children versus other. I know the theoretical differences between developmental approaches and the behavioral approaches. One can talk about Skinner's theory about language is very different from developmental theory of language emerging from early interactions and so on. But those are theoretical differences. We need to see whether the predictions from those theories in terms of child responses to treatment are correct or not, whether it's true that children learn better in one way versus the other ways. And the only way to do that is to compare the two into the same design. If we test it separately, we will see changes, but we don't know whether the change comes from the hypothesized mechanism that is behind our particular intervention. So from a research point of view, it's crucial to understand the mechanisms of change. Of course, that research needs to be framed in a very cautious way, because it will be very easy to say, well, you know, I see this p-value suggests that this treatment works better than this other treatment. This research requires a more sophisticated approach to this, looking at what variable, what predicts what, basically, is the interaction between specific children or even family factors or other factors predicting changes. Or it's a more straightforward story of one is definitely creating changes that we don't see in the other therapy. We can only address these issues if we do this kind of research.
Yeah. I think also part of the difficulty in perhaps getting funding and approval for intervention studies from an ethical standpoint now is then about our waitlist control groups. So often in a really rigorous study, we have to have, you know, half of the children randomly assigned to get the intervention and half randomly assigned to do nothing effectively, or to do just community service, whatever the local community practice is, so we can compare that. And John, your point about unlike the pharmaceutical trials where we would expect a result very quickly, if we were going to buy into that, with autism intervention studies, we're not looking for a quick fix. We're looking for building up skills in these kids in the long term that will really set them up well. And so there's the ethical consideration as well of having half of your children assigned to not do an intervention, so or to be doing standard community practice, which we have no idea if it's going to help them. So I think this moving now in a shift in the research to designs which compare two interventions one to the other, rather than one intervention to treatment as usual or waitlist control, might be a nice way of moving forward the field. Still with the rigorous design, but also without the ethical conundrum of what do we do with the half of the kids who aren't trialling the given intervention. Well, actually, we're not trialling one anymore, we're trialling two against the other. We're nearly out of time. I did want to talk a little bit about the practice and the translation of research. So John, you're working in a clinical service, you said not at a university. Tell us about what your service is doing, translating behavioural intervention research now into community service for these kids and families.
Sure. One important line of research that we've taken up is comparing the effectiveness of group instruction versus one-to-one. We can foresee some considerable potential advantages in group instruction, not just in terms of ability to serve more children with the same number of staff, but also the opportunity for children to learn how to learn from each other, which is a lot of what's happening in regular education. And potentially the sooner we can get children to be able to benefit from participation in group, you know, the better prepared they will be to be able to go into regular education kinds of settings. So that's one example of something that we've been able to do. Another area that is doable for us as a service agency is looking at strategies for teaching social skills and doing some comparisons of different approaches. For example, social stories, which is a widely utilized model for teaching. It's regarded as solidly established, but if you look carefully at what the evidence is, it's actually fairly limited in documenting it in an experimental way, the effectiveness of this approach. So we're looking at doing some comparisons of a more structured behavioral approach, and one difference in particular that requires active student responding within the social teaching sessions, as opposed to social stories, which is more of a passive exposure kind of model, and looking at what the results tell us.
Great, lots of interesting stuff going on there. How about you, Giacomo? What's happening in our local area?
Well, we're looking at the active ingredients of what we're doing. What is it that helps? What is it that drives outcomes? We focused on imitation. For example, we looked at spontaneous imitation versus imitation on demand, and we found that spontaneous imitation is more relevant to outcomes compared to imitation in a structured, elicited way. And so we're looking at, this is informing our strategies, we're looking at ways to promote, to foster the spontaneous use of imitation. And related to that, we're looking at the benefits of social inclusion. Now, social inclusion is something that is highly important for parents, for clinicians as well, but there's not much information out there on how to do that, how to implement a good social inclusion program that actually helps with social learning, with spontaneous learning of children from other children who don't have autism. Again, we will be able to learn more if we do this rigorous experimental research that we currently undertaken, which involves some logistical challenges. But these are questions that at this point we don't have answers to these questions, and that's why we need to target those active ingredients, those important factors.
And I've talked about pharmaceutical studies not related to autism, but some people will say, well, this is something that we can only understand behaviourally, but surely it's something about what's going on in the brain. Why can't we just wait until there's a biological treatment for autism where we can give a drug or do something biological to intervene? What would you say to that?
There is a biological treatment for autism. It's called education. Learning is a biological process. When children learn, there are new neural connections that are established. The brain is changing. So what we're doing is biological. We're not at the level yet where we can measure this in a very fine-grained way, especially with very young children and with those who will then comply to the procedures of neuroimaging studies. But education is a biological treatment.
So we're not just changing behaviour, we're changing the brain, how everything works.
Yes.
Great. Okay, well, unfortunately, we have to leave it there for today. So thanks very much to John for joining us virtually from California in your office. And thanks, Giacomo, for coming in.
Thank you.
And thank you to everyone for watching our episode of Inside the Lab.